on the day he shot Billy Ray Cobb, Peter Willard, and Deputy Dwayne Looney. His mental condition was normal, and he could tell right from wrong. Thank you, Doctor. I have no further questions. Any questions, Mr. Briggins? Noose asked. A few questions, Your Honor. Working from his notes, Jake asked Dr. Roadheaver a series of careful questions about the theory of psychiatry. The doctor agreed that psychiatry could never be an exact science, and that there would always be different opinions. Jake then asked how many cases Dr. Roadheaver had been a witness in. He replied that this was the 43rd. Jake checked something in a file and looked at the doctor with a nasty little smile. Are you sure it's not your 46th? It could be, yes. I'm not certain. The courtroom became still. Buckley looked up from his notes and watched his witness carefully. 46 times you've spoken for the state in insanity trials? If you say so. And 46 times you've said that the defendant was not legally insane. Correct, Doctor? I'm not sure. Well, let me make it simple. You've been a witness 46 times, and 46 times it has been your opinion the defendant was not legally insane. Correct? Roadheaver moved in his chair and for the first time looked uncomfortable. I'm not sure. You've never seen a legally insane defendant, have you, Doctor? Of course I have. Good. Would you then, please, sir, tell us the name of the defendant and where he was tried? Roadheaver breathed deeply and looked at the ceiling. Jake looked across at the jurors. They were awake and waiting for an answer. I can't remember, he finally said. Jake lifted a pile of papers and waved it at the witness. Is it possible, Doctor, that the reason you can't remember is that in 11 years, 46 trials, you have never spoken for the defendant? I honestly can't remember. Can you honestly name us one trial in which you found the defendant to be legally insane? I'm sure there are some. Yes or no, Doctor? One trial? The medical witness looked at Buckley. No. My memory fails me. I cannot. Jake walked slowly to the defense table and picked up a thick file. Dr. Roadheaver, do you remember being a witness in the trial of a man by the name of Danny Booker in McMurphy County in December 1975? Yes, I remember that trial. And you said that he was not legally insane, didn't you? That is correct. Do you remember how many psychiatrists spoke for him? Not exactly. There were several. There were 3, Dr. Roadheaver, and they all said the man was legally insane. How many other doctors agreed with you? None, if I remember correctly. So it was 3 against 1. Yes, but what did the jury do, Doctor? He was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Thank you. Now, Dr. Roadheaver, you're the head doctor at Whitfield Psychiatric Hospital, aren't you? Yes. And where is Danny Booker today? Roadheaver looked desperately at Buckley, but then had to turn back to Jake to answer the question. He waited 1 second too long for the jury. They were losing trust in him. He's at Whitfield, isn't he? Jake asked. I believe so, Roadheaver said. And is this man legally insane, Doctor? I don't think so. But you said in court that Danny Booker was not mad and understood what he was doing when he killed his wife. The jury disagreed with you and found him not guilty, and since that time he has been a patient in your hospital, under your care, and treated as a patient with a mental illness. Is that correct? The jury could see that it was. And Jake then asked the doctor about 5 more cases, 4 men and 1 woman. In each one, Dr. Roadheaver had said the person was not insane. But in each case, the jury had disagreed, and now they were all in Dr. Roadheaver's hospital. Jake asked how this was possible. You just can't trust juries, said the doctor, without thinking. Jake looked at him with a sad smile, then looked at the jury. He folded his arms and allowed Roadheaver's words to sink in. He waited, looking at the witness. Finally, he turned to the judge. I think we've heard enough from this witness, Your Honor. We have no more questions. Jake knew that he had destroyed Buckley's medical witness. There were no more witnesses. It was time for the closing arguments. Jake talked directly to the jury. He began with his biggest problem, Dr. W.T. Bass. He apologized to the jury. He asked them to believe that he would never use a man with a criminal record as a witness if he knew the facts. He raised his hand and swore to them that he had not known. He then asked them to think about what Dr. Bass had said. Yes, 30 years ago, he had had sex with a girl under 18 in Texas. Does that mean he is lying now in this trial? Does that mean you cannot trust his professional opinion? Be fair to Bass the psychiatrist. Forget Bass the person. And please, be fair to his patient, Carl Lee Haley. He knew nothing of the doctor's past. Then Jake told them that the girl had become Bass's wife and had died with their child in a train crash. Mr. Buckley had not mentioned that. He waited a moment and let them think about it. And what about Dr. Roadheaver? He asked. Maybe he had sex with a girl under 18 once. Maybe he didn't. Does that make him a better or a worse psychiatrist? The problem with Dr. Roadheaver is that although he is a highly trained doctor who treats thousands of people for all sorts of mental illnesses, when crimes are involved, he cannot recognize insanity. They watched him, listened to every word. He was not loud and overconfident like Buckley. He was quiet. He looked tired, almost hurt. Jake asked the jury to forgive him for his lack of experience. If he had made mistakes, it was not his client's fault. He talked about daughters. He told the jury about his own daughter. She was 4, almost 5, and she was the center of his world. She was special. She was a little girl, and he had to protect her. Carl Lee had a daughter. Her name was Tanya. He pointed to her on the front row, next to her mother and brothers. She's a beautiful little girl, 10 years old, and now she can never have children. She can never have a daughter. Objection! Buckley shouted. Sustained. Jake talked about rape and explained how rape is much worse than murder. With murder, the victim is gone, and not forced to deal with what happened to her. The family must deal with it, but not the victim. But rape is much worse. The victim has a lifetime of trying to understand, of asking questions, and knowing the rapist may someday escape or be freed. Every hour of every day, the victim thinks of the rape and asks herself 1,000 questions. She relives it step by step, minute by minute, and it hurts just as badly. And if this happens to a child? A 10-year-old child? Imagine you're a parent. How would you explain to your child why she was raped? How would you explain why she cannot have children?
Objection! Sustained. Please ignore that, ladies and gentlemen.
What would you do? Asked Jake. What would a father do? Jake paused for a drink of water. He changed direction now. He stopped looking hurt. He looked angry. He talked about Cobb and Willard, drug sellers and rapists. Was this country a better place without them? Certainly. And Deputy Looney, a man who had lost a leg, thought so too. He had said that they should thank Carl Lee for what he had done. He was a hero. He asked the jury to follow Looney's wishes. He became much quieter and said he was almost finished. He wanted to leave them with one thought. Picture this, if they could. When she was lying there, beaten, covered in her own blood, tied to 2 trees, she had looked into the woods around her. She wanted her daddy. She thought he was coming, but it was only a dream. Ladies and gentlemen, he continued, she needs him now, as much as she needed him then. Please, don't take him away. She's waiting on the front row for her daddy. Let him go home to his family. The courtroom was silent as Jake sat down next to his client. He looked at the jury and saw Wanda Warnack brush away a tear with her finger. For the first time in 2 days, he felt some hope. At 4 o'clock, Judge Noose spoke to the jury. He told them to get organized and get busy. He told them they could discuss things until 6, maybe 7, but if they could not make a decision, he would ask them to meet again on Tuesday morning. They stood up and walked out. No one expected a quick decision. Chapter 14. Guilty or not guilty? The jury did not make a decision by 7 o'clock, and Judge Noose instructed them to go back to their hotel and return to the court at 9 a.m. the next day. Jake went back to Lucien's house. He had no home, no wife, no law clerk, but at least he had some friends. Harry Rex joined them, and they sat on the porch drinking beer and eating fried potatoes. They could only wait. Jake had done everything he could. At 9 a.m. the next day, the square in front of the courthouse was crowded again. Reverend Agee led his people as they shouted louder and louder, "Free Carl Lee! Free Carl Lee!" The clan shouted back, "Fry Carl Lee!" But not as loudly as before. There seemed to be fewer of them today, and they did not seem so confident. Everyone had been talking about Jake's final speech. The jury arrived and began their discussion in the jury room. Jake and Harry Rex sat in the empty courtroom looking across at Buckley. By midday, there was still no decision, but the crowds outside the courthouse were getting bigger. During lunch, the 10,000 grew to 15,000. Carl Lee had been allowed to come into the courtroom and sit with Tanya and the others. At 4 o'clock, around the time when the jury had to report to the judge, they walked to one of the tall windows at the front of the courtroom. Carl Lee noticed a small handle. He turned it, and the windows swung open. Carl Lee looked at the deputy beside him and stepped forward. He held Tanya in the air and watched the crowd. They saw him. They shouted his name and rushed to the building under him. Reverend Agee led the marchers off the street and across the square. A wave of black people pressed forward for a closer look at their man. "Free Carl Lee! Free Carl Lee! Free Carl Lee!" He waved at his people below him. He kissed his daughter and his sons. He waved and told the children to wave too. The crowd went wild. Judge Noose asked to see the lawyers in his office. He was worried. Buckley was angry and wanted a new trial. He said that the jury could not make a fair decision with this crowd outside. Jake laughed at him and said that he had wanted the trial to be moved away from Clanton. It was too late now. Buckley then said that the jury should be moved to another place while they made up their minds. Jake brought out a pile of legal documents which showed that this could not be done. They had to finish this business in Clanton. When the jury came in to report, apart from the reporters, the courtroom was solid black. The Klan had clearly decided it was not a good place to be. The jurors looked tired and unhappy.
"Have you made a decision?" Judge Noose asked.
"No, sir," replied the head of the jury.
"Do you think you will be able to make a decision if you have more time?"
"We've talked about that, Your Honor, and we'd like to leave, get a good night's rest, and try again tomorrow. We're not ready to stop." Wednesday. For the first time in weeks, Jake slept more than 8 hours. He had fallen asleep on the sofa in his office, and he awoke at 5 to the sounds of the army getting ready for the worst. He had rested, but he could not stop thinking that this would probably be the big day. He showered and shaved downstairs. He then took a new shirt from its packet and dressed himself in Lucien's best dark blue suit. It was too short and a bit loose, but not a bad fit under the circumstances. He thought about his house on Adams Street and how Carla would feel. For the first time in a week, he went across to the coffee shop for breakfast. The manager, Dell, greeted him like a lost child and came and sat next to him at a corner table. As the other customers arrived and saw him, they stopped and shook his hand. It was good to see him again. They had missed him, and they were on his side. He looked thin, Dell said, so he ordered most of the things on the menu. It felt good to be there. He stayed for an hour and talked to people, then went across to his office. There was nothing to do except wait. He sat by the window, drank coffee, smoked a cigarette, and watched the soldiers. He thought about a quiet little Southern law office with a secretary and clients waiting to see him. Of normal things, like a family, a home, and church on Sunday mornings. Maybe he should leave these big cases to others. When the jury arrived at 9 a.m. as usual, there were even more people than the day before. The jurors could see nothing but a sea of black faces when their bus stopped outside the court. They were scared. In the jury room, Wanda Warnack stood at the end of the table and nervously asked for attention.
"I have a suggestion," she said slowly, "that might help us decide this thing."
Suddenly, she had their complete attention.
I thought of something last night when I couldn't sleep, and I want you to think about it too. It may be painful. It may make you search your heart and take a long look at your soul. But I'll ask you to do it anyway. And if each of you will be honest with yourself, I think we can finish before midday.
The only sounds came from the street below.
Good. This is what I want you to do. I want you to pretend with me for a moment. I want you to use your imaginations. I want you to close your eyes and listen to my voice and nothing else.
They closed their eyes. They were ready to try anything. At around 11 o'clock, the phone rang in Jake's office. It rang again, and Lucien answered it. He listened, then put the phone down. "What is it?" Harry Rex demanded. Jake sat up and looked at Lucien. The moment had arrived. "The jury is ready." "Oh, my God," Jake said. "Listen to me, Jake," said Lucien. "Stay calm. Be careful what you say." "That's strange advice coming from you, Lucien," Jake replied. "I've learned a lot. If you win, be careful what you say to reporters. Make sure you thank the jury. If you lose..." "If you lose," Harry Rex said, "run as fast as you can, because those people out there will bring down the courthouse." "I feel weak," said Jake. When Jake entered the courtroom, Carl Lee was already there, sitting at the defense table. Gwen and Lester had tears in their eyes. The children were confused and scared. Judge Noose came to his chair and sat down, and the courtroom became totally silent. There was no sound from the outside. 20,000 blacks knelt on the ground and prayed. There was perfect silence, inside the courtroom and out. The door from the jury room opened, and it seemed like an hour before the first juror came out with tears in her eyes. Jake dropped his head. Carl Lee looked ahead at a painting on the wall above Judge Noose's seat. The jurors slowly took their places. They seemed scared. Most had been crying. Jake felt sick. The head of the jury held a piece of paper. "Ladies and gentlemen, have you made your decision?"
"Yes, sir, we have,"
he answered quietly. His voice shook as he spoke. "Hand it to the clerk, please." She took it and handed it to His Honor, who studied it. "It is technically in order," he finally said. One juror was crying, the only sound in the courtroom. Other jurors held handkerchiefs to their eyes. The crying could mean only one thing to Jake. Noose looked at Carl Lee. "Will the defendant please rise?" Jake's client stood up slowly. Jake closed his eyes and stopped breathing. His hand shook and his stomach ached. Noose handed the paper back to the clerk of the court. "Please read it, Madam Clerk." She unfolded it and faced the defendant.
"On each of the charges against him, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty by reason of insanity."
The courtroom exploded. Carl Lee turned and ran to where his children were sitting. Tanya and the boys reached forward and held him. Gwen screamed and burst into tears. She buried her head in Lester's arms. People stood on the seats and shouted, "Praise the Lord!" Jake felt nothing. His only movement was a weak smile in the direction of the jury. He wanted to cry, but just sat at the defense table, trying to smile, unable to do anything else. From the corner of his eye, He could see Buckley removing files and important-looking papers and throwing them all into bags. A boy ran between two deputies and out of the door, shouting, "Not guilty! Not guilty!" to the crowd waiting outside. Judge Noose looked at the lawyers.
If there's nothing else, this court will now close. As I have heard nothing to say that Mr. Haley is now insane, he is free to leave this court.
Carl Lee stood in the middle of his family. They had their arms around him, and everyone was crying and shouting, "Praise the Lord." They gathered round Jake and held him and said they loved him. The reporters began firing questions at Jake. He held up his hands and said he would make no comments now, but there would be a conference in his office at 2 p.m. Buckley left through a side door. The jurors went back to the jury room to wait for the last bus ride to the hotel. The reporters crowded round Carl Lee.
"I just want to go home," he said again and again. "I just want to go home."
After the dancing in the square outside the courthouse had ended, after the thousands of happy supporters had all gone home, Jake, Harry Rex, and Lucien went to Lucien's house and ate a mountain of pork and vegetables.
"You look very silly," Harry Rex said to Jake.
"Shut up, Harry Rex," Lucien said. "Let him enjoy his finest hour."
"He's enjoying it. Look at that smile."
"What should I tell reporters?" Jake asked.
"Tell him you need some clients," Harry Rex said.
"Clients will be no problem," Lucien said. "They'll be waiting on the sidewalks asking to meet you." They drove back into town in Harry Rex's old Ford. As they passed a row of houses on the right, Jake asked him to stop. Harry Rex pulled off the road and parked under a tree. Jake got out, looked around the front yard, and walked onto the porch. He knocked on the door. A man asked who was there. "I'm Jake Briggins," and the door flew open and the man came out and took Jake's hand. "Nice to meet you, Jake. I'm Mac Lloyd Crowell. You've done a good job. I'm proud to meet you." Jake shook his hand. "You looking for Wanda?" Crowell asked. "Well, yes. I was just passing, and I remembered her address from the jury research." "You've come to the right place. She lives here, and I do too most of the time. We ain't married, but we go together. She's lying down resting. She's pretty tired." "Don't wake her," Jake said. "She told me what happened. She won it for you." "How? What happened?" "She made them all close their eyes and listen to her. She told them to pretend that the little girl had blonde hair and blue eyes, that the two rapists were black, that they tied her right foot to a tree and her left foot to a fence post, that they raped her repeatedly and swore at her because she was white. She told them to picture the little girl lying there, begging for her daddy, while they kicked her in the mouth and knocked out her teeth, broke both jaws, broke a nose. She made them imagine two drunk blacks pouring beer on her like that and laughing. And then she told them to imagine that the little girl belonged to them, their daughter. She told them to be honest with themselves and to write on a piece of paper whether or not they would kill those men if they got the chance. And they voted on it. All 12 said they would do the killing. 12-0. Wanda said she'd sit in that jury room until Christmas before she'd vote that Carl Lee was guilty. And if they were honest with themselves, then they ought to feel the same way. They agreed with her. Jake listened to every word without breathing. He heard a noise. Wanda Warnack walked to the screen door. She smiled at him and began crying. He looked at her, but could not talk. She wiped her eyes and looked at him and shook the hand he held out to her. 100 cars were parked east and west of the Haley house. The long front yard was packed with vehicles, children playing, and parents sitting under trees. Harry Rex parked, and a crowd rushed to greet Carl Lee's lawyer. Lester held him and said, "You've done it again." Carl Lee came out, and they shook hands and smiled at each other, both searching for words. They put their arms round each other. The crowd clapped and shouted. "Thank you, Jake," Carl Lee said softly. At 2:30, Jake sat at his desk and talked to Carla on the phone, while Lucien and Harry Rex drank beer. He told his wife he would leave in 3 hours and be in North Carolina tomorrow. Yes, he was fine, he said. Everything was okay. It was all finished. There was a crowd of reporters in his conference room, so she shouldn't miss the evening news. He said he loved her. Tomorrow, he'd call Ellen. "Why are you leaving?" Lucien demanded. "You're stupid, Jake. Just stupid," Harry Rex shouted. "You've got 1,000 reporters waiting for you, and you're leaving town. Stupid. Just stupid." Jake stood up. "How do I look?" "Pretty stupid if you leave," Harry Rex said. "Wait for a couple of days," Lucien said. "This is an opportunity you'll never have again. Please, Jake." "Relax. I'm going to meet them now. Let them take my picture, answer a few questions. Then I'm leaving town. I've got to talk to my wife. I've got a lot of explaining to do." "You're crazy, Jake," Harry Rex said. "I agree," said Lucien. Jake looked in the mirror, straightened his borrowed tie, and smiled at his friends. "I love you too. I really do. And hey, I got paid $900 for this trial, and I plan to share it with you." They emptied the last cans of beer and followed Jake Brigance down the stairs to face the report.